as the syllabus said, so, and as I said right here at the outset, what we're doing, this is a seminar on objectivism. So we're doing a year-long study of the objectivist philosophy. And there's two broad things I want to talk about. So one, a little bit about what is objectivism, and two, some about what is philosophy. And that was the topic that I put as, this is the topic for this afternoon, or at least afternoon for me. So I'm on the East Coast, so it's afternoon here. I know we have people from around the world. So for some people it's just noontime. For people in Europe and so on, it's later. And it's really great to have people from around the world. We have a lot of international people this year, which is fun. Yeah, so there's two broad things. I want to talk about objectivism a bit, and I want to talk about philosophy and objectivism's perspective on philosophy as well, and we'll talk about that. But so if we ask what is objectivism, there's various perspectives you can take on answering that, and I want to bring up some of the perspectives that are relevant to thinking about what objectivism is. I think most obviously and most directly, the answer to what is objectivism, it's Ayn Rand's philosophy. So it's the name that she gave to her philosophy. And it literally is a name. I mean, so it's a proper name. She developed or formulated a philosophy, and she said, I've called this objectivism. It's my philosophy. And in that sense, when we're talking about objectivism, we're talking about Ayn Rand's philosophical writings and the writings that she had endorsed, which means she endorsed when she was alive. So she wrote, I'm sure many of you know this, but perhaps not all. I mean, she wrote and was the lead editor of her series of publications, the Objectivist newsletter, the Objectivist, the Ayn Rand letter, many of the essays from the various books, Virtue of Selfishness, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, Philosophy, Who Needs It, come from essays that were written for those periodicals. And there were other contributors to those periodicals. And she made it clear when she thought, yeah, this is an aspect or a component of my philosophy of objectivism. And if you really want to study objectivism, I want to stress this, and particularly want to stress this in this day and age, you need to read Ayn Rand. You need to read the original source, the person who formulated it. And this includes both, incidentally, this includes both the fiction and the nonfiction. And we will come back to that issue, that it includes both periodically through the course, particularly when we talk about some of the moral principles in objectivism. I meet more and more people. So as I get older, everyone else seems to be staying the same age, but that's because I meet new students and new students. But as I get older, I meet more and more students who I'm surprised by the how little they've read of Ayn Rand. Now, from one perspective, it's not surprising because there's so much more material out there about objectivism than when I was a student. I mean, I was a student, at least as an undergraduate student, is pre-OPAR. That is, I was a student in college before Dr. Peikoff's Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, that book, which is part of the reading for the course, or at least significant segments of it are for the course, before that book was published. And so it was much more clear that if you're going to try to learn objectivism, what you need to do is read Ayn Rand, because that was by far the most that existed on objectivism. That's what there was to read. And if you want to study, that's what you would do. Whereas now there's many more resources, both from Dr. Peikoff, and we're using some in the course, but from other scholars. I mean, there's some of my own. Aaron Ben have things. There's Tara Smith. There's Greg Salmieri. There's Harry Binswanger. There's a lot of people who now are writing about objectivism. But I still think if you're really serious about studying, you have to go to the source, which is Ayn Rand's writings. And as I think you have seen in the syllabus, we're going to do we're going to cover and discuss a fair amount of Ayn Rand's own writings in the course. And the other kind of secondary source material is essentially going to be from Dr. Peikoff, and I think his materials have a special status. He was a longtime student of Ayn Rand. He, I think, mastered the philosophy in a way that no one else did as a student. Like, he was by far her best student, I think. So he has a special place. It's sort of quasi-primary, and she endorsed some of his materials, such as the lecture course from which Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, from which that comes. In 1976, she endorsed that as this is consistent with Objectivism, or as an expression of my philosophy. She endorsed The Ominous Parallels, which is the book he published before Ayn Rand died. So it has a special status, but we're also looking at some of his material that came out after Ayn Rand died, such as in this, I asked you to listen to lecture 1 of Understanding Objectivism, and that came out after Ayn Rand died. So you should not think of that as objectivism, because it's not something that she could have endorsed, because she didn't see it, didn't see the actual product. So from one perspective, you can say what objectivism is the name of Ayn Rand's philosophy. Then you can give, if you ask, well, what is objectivism? Another kind of answer is to give a summary of its essence. And Ayn Rand does that in a few places, including in one of the readings, philosophical detection, that was assigned for this time. And that's to give a brief summary of its key ideas or key principles. She also does that in a short essay called Introducing Objectivism, which I'm sure many of you have seen. It's up on Ayn Rand campus. It's in The Voice of Reason. It's in the, reprinted. It's reprinted in the Ayn Rand column. And there she says, what is objectivism? Well, it's key ideas in metaphysics, objective reality, in epistemology, reason, in ethics or morality, self-interest, in politics, capitalism. And she gives that as this is a summary of its essential content or essential tenets, essential principles. Now that list, incidentally, and I put this in one of the class announcements before we got started. I think I sent it out today, actually, that you should, when you're reading Ayn Rand, and I'm going to come back to this, but when you're reading Ayn Rand, you should have a lot of questions about what she's writing, arguing, the points she makes. One of the things, for instance, interesting in introducing objectivism is she's introducing her philosophy, she's giving a summary of it, and there's no mention of aesthetics. There's no mention of what we read Philosophy Who Needs It, the lead essay from the book, is a branch of philosophy, and yet there's no mention of it. And that should be interesting. And why is there no mention of it? Does she think it's a dispensable branch? Well, how does she think of it exactly? In Philosophical Detection, so the companion essay to Philosophy Who Needs It, she does mention aesthetics, and her formulations are a little different than in Introducing Objectivism. But I think the essence is the same. What is objectivism? It upholds the law of identity, the supremacy of reason, rational egoism, individual rights, and then she puts in brackets, i.e., that is capitalism, and metaphysical values, and that's in aesthetics. So from another perspective, you can give, this is its essential content. A lot would go into unpacking what is meant by any of these ideas or any of these principles. But that's another perspective. It's the name of Ayn Rand's philosophy. It's what she formulated and put together as a system of philosophy. you can look at it then from, well, what is it essentially saying? What does it essentially advocate? What is its core principles? And then you can give a quick encapsulation of that, as she does, as I just talked about. Another perspective, which is relevant for some of what I want to talk about today, is, so she said, formally, I call my philosophy objectivism. Informally, I call it a philosophy for living on Earth. And that's another perspective on its content. It's not listing, okay, here's its core idea in each of the branches of philosophy, but its aim or purpose. It's supposed to be to help you live. It's supposed to be a guide for life. And part of what I asked you to think about in preparation for this lecture, and part of the reading assignments or the assignments of listening to the first lecture of Dr. Peikoff's Understanding Objectivism, which is up on Ayn Rand campus, he's talking about arguments against philosophy. And as he stresses there, I mean, from a certain perspective, these arguments fly in the face of what objectivism purports to say about philosophy, that it's supposed to be a guide to life. So it's not supposed to be a hindrance or useless. It's supposed to be a guide or a positive. It's supposed to bring positives to your life. And that was a perspective that she had on objectivism. And I think her whole orientation to philosophy is what philosophy is about, is learning how to live better. So that's another, and I think, important perspective to keep in mind when we're thinking about what is objectivism. And I'm starting with this since the whole course is a seminar on objectivism. And we're going to dive deeper and discuss some of these, some of its issues and principles and ideas and perspective on the world. I want to just set an outset of some ways to think about objectivism. So think about what it is that we're going on to explore in more detail. So here's another, I'm going to give two more perspectives. And these two are the kind of zooming out and getting a wider perspective on what objectivism is. And this is one of the ways that I think about it. It's the philosophy of the Enlightenment. It's the philosophy that the Enlightenment needed, and in its best aspects and elements was trying to move toward, but never got there. The Enlightenment and the thinkers, the leading thinkers, particularly the leading philosophical thinkers in the Enlightenment period, never got to a point where they got anything, I think, close actually to what objectivism advocates and so on. But from looking backwards, you can say this is what they were moving towards. And if you think, for instance, so one of the ways Ayn Rand puts it in Philosophical Detection, the supremacy of reason. What the Enlightenment was about was trying to make this a principle, indeed the core principle of the culture. It's the supremacy of reason. Or she puts it, individual rights. Well, the Enlightenment is the period in which the concept and principle of individual rights is being formulated. Now, I think not fully consistently or not a full case for it, but it's being formulated and being thought of as this is the foundation or base of political organization, of political philosophy, and how we should be trying to organize politically. She puts it, it's about rational egoism, or in introducing objectivism, it's about self-interest. Well, it's during the Enlightenment where you get the idea, as it's formulated in the Declaration of Independence, about the pursuit of happiness. And as objectivists often stress, that means the pursuit of your own happiness. and that there's something important and moral about that then is going to be protected and sort of ingrained in proper political systems or political organization. And she puts it in Introducing Objectivism, it's about objective reality, or in philosophical detection, the law of identity. And it's a focus on this world, and that it's governed by law. It's intelligible and can be understood if you have the right orientation towards it. That too is what you're getting in the Enlightenment, and the whole, it's coming out of the scientific revolution in Western thought. And this is a perspective of a refocusing on reality, and that it's intelligible, and that it's intelligible if you formulate proper, you can say logical, putting it a little more specifically, inductive principles about reality. And objectivism, that is its focus as well. It's the key ideas of the Enlightenment are key ideas of objectivism, but objectivism has something, I think, at the least, more to say about these key ideas, but often something different about the very nature of the idea, and certainly about its source. That is, where this idea comes from, why it's true, what the argument and evidence in support of it is. But that's another perspective, and from the positive perspective, that it's the objectivism is the philosophy of the Enlightenment. It's the philosophy of the Enlightenment deserved, but unfortunately never reached, I think. And you can look at this point from the flip side, and this is one way that Ayn Rand looks at it. I think she, in the end, looks at it both ways. And I'll read a little bit. So this comes from when in the last, so I said the periodicals were the Objectivist newsletter, the Objectivist, and the Ayn Rand letter. At the end of the Objectivist, she wrote an article called Brief Summary, and she gives some of this perspective. And I want to read a little bit about this, because the next point is really the flip side of it's the philosophy of the Enlightenment. And she emphasizes that philosophy is about the positive. So let me read, these are a couple of, not super lengthy, but more than just a couple sentence paragraphs from what she writes. So I'm quoting here from Ayn Rand, a brief summary. Quote, "I have mentioned in many articles that Kant," so that's the philosopher Immanuel Kant, "is the chief destroyer of the modern world. My primary concern, however, was not to engage in polemics, but to present a rational approach to philosophy, untainted by any Kantian influence, and to indicate the connection of philosophy to man's life here on earth, a connection which Kant had severed. It is useless to be against anything unless one knows what one is for. A merely negative stand is always futile, as, for instance, the stand of the conservatives, who are against communism, but not for capitalism. One cannot start with or build on a negative. It is only by establishing what is the good that one can know what is evil and why." Close quote. And then skipping a few paragraphs and now quoting again from what, continuing from that article, but a few paragraphs later. Quote, if on the positive basis of my philosophy, I may be permitted to express a negative consideration, as a consequence and a side issue, I would like to say, paraphrasing Ragnar Deneskiold in Atlas Shrugged, so a character from Atlas Shrugged, I've chosen a special mission of my own. I'm after a man whom I want to destroy. He died 167 years ago, but until the last trace of him is wiped out of men's minds, we will not have a decent world to live in. And then in Atlas, Reardon asks, what man? So she puts, so what man? Immanuel Kant. close quote. And you will find many references to Kant in Ayn Rand's writings, including in what we read for this class, in Philosophy Who Needs It. When she's talking to the cadets at West Point, she brings up Kant a few times. And this, I think, was a focus. As she says, it's not the primary focus, it's a side issue. But she was out to try to eradicate the Kantian influences in philosophy. And looking at this from the perspective of the positive and of what I was talking about in regard to the Enlightenment, Objectivism's view of the kind of intellectual history here, which I think is the right view, is that Kant ends the Enlightenment. He's the philosopher who turns directly against the Enlightenment and says you're not really connected to reality, or at least your rational mind is not connected to reality. He's no longer about the supremacy of reason. There's other ways to be in touch with reality. He bars self-interest and happiness from the realm of ethics. And the view is there's argument in objectivism that all of this leads to the growing statism and collectivism that you get in philosophical circles in the 19th century. So looking at that she's the opponent of Kant, I think is just the flip side of thinking that she's the philosopher for the Enlightenment. And this Kant is the arch enemy of the Enlightenment. And in trying to answer Kant, she is defending the Enlightenment or its basic ideas against what he was arguing. So the last perspective on what is objectivism, and it's again it's a zooming out from that. It's a perspective that you get in the epilogue of Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. It's a perspective that I think Ayn Rand had. We'll see it in a reading for next week, which is from the transcript, the nonfiction writing course, where she talks about philosophy as a duel between Plato and Aristotle. And that's the language that Dr. Peikoff uses then in, so Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, the abbreviation we use is OPAR. So I'm going to start calling it OPAR now. In the epilogue, it's about the duel between Plato and Aristotle. And this is not, this idea is not originated by Ayn Rand, or it's not unique to objectivism, but it's something that she agreed with, and I think is right to agree with. That philosophy, there's basically two positions in philosophy: the Platonic position and the Aristotelian position, and you're one or the other in philosophy. And so the widest perspective on objectivism is that what objectivism is a major philosophical development in the Aristotelian tradition. So it's a continuation of Aristotle's basic approach to philosophy, but it has new ideas and new principles. And when she talks about Aristotle, there's things she disagrees with in his philosophy. But if you think, and she always thinks of philosophy in terms of its fundamental ideas, that she views herself as fundamentally an Aristotelian. And that's a perspective, an important perspective to have on what objectivism is. It's a philosophy that is in the Aristotelian tradition as against Plato. And in this regard, as the objectivism and Ayn Rand viewed Kant as a continuation of Plato's orientation in philosophy. And again, if you read the epilogue of OPAR, this is discussed at some length. And the way to look at objectivism is it's a continuation of Aristotle's approach to philosophy. Okay, so that's a word about what objectivism is. I want to make a couple of other, or actually one other point about just thinking about the class, and then I'll pause and we can take some questions and have a bit of discussion. And what I want to emphasize is what we're doing in this course is we're studying objectivism. So we're trying to get a better or deeper understanding of what objectivism is. The goal is not to try to convince you or anyone else that the philosophy is true, but to understand what the philosophy is, and you could say from a different perspective, of why Ayn Rand thinks it's true. Why she's arguing that these principles are correct and that this philosophical system is correct. Now, and part of the reason I'm making this point is, well, one, I self-identify as an objectivist. And I know, or I'm guessing at least, but for some people I certainly know this, that many of the students in the course self-identify as objectivists. So the idea is that you agree with the philosophy, but the class is not really presupposing that. So it's not for just people who agree with the philosophy. And indeed, I'm going to make some points about the fact that I think objectivists tend to be too uncritical, so that I'm going to try to develop and hope that you're on board with being more critical than objectivists typically are about objectivism. So the context here is, and I don't want to try to hide the fact, I mean, I'm at the Ayn Rand Institute, so it's a little hard to hide the fact that I view myself as an objectivist, but that should not influence how you think, and if you have questions and if you have doubts about things and you wonder if this principle is true or not, all of that should come up in the course if you have these kinds of questions, doubts, and so on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what an objectivist is, because I think it's worth talking just a little bit about that. But let me pause here because I've gone on for about 20 or 25 minutes. And so on this first point about what objectivism is, and then you can have different perspectives in answering that question. I think all perspectives that integrate together, but you can have different perspectives on it. Any either questions about that, follow-up comments, or something more that you would want to discuss or kind of analyze a little bit more? Yeah, so you should be able, so who's that? Steve is asking, how do we ask a question? So you could ask it in the chat if you want. You can also unmute and just ask the question, and you should have,
just like that? Just unmute?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so who's that?
It's Steve. Can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder, it's interesting. I wonder if there's even a wider perspective talking about zooming out. I can't remember if it was Dr. Peikoff or Ayn Rand who once kind of said that there is, metaphysically, in one way, there is no philosophy, right? There's just entities out there. And I've heard some people say, obviously it's a vast oversimplification, but when you explain to people who are not familiar with objectivism, they go, well, this is just common sense. This is just reality. And on one level, there is no philosophy, right? There's existence, there's consciousness. And if one is using one's mind rationally, using reason, there's just reality, there's reason, there's logic. And there is no, I mean, on some level, before Ayn Rand was born, there was reality, there was a form of reason and logic. And on one level, it's, you know, in a healthier culture, this would be, I don't want to say common sense, but on the widest level, it's just truth. It's just reality. It's just, so, I mean, I think that's possibly the widest zoom out you can think of, but can you speak to that in a way?
Yeah, sure. What you're saying, I think there's an element of truth in it, but you can push it too far. So, and this is actually going to be a topic for next time, because it relates to the issue of rationalism, which is a false way of approaching philosophy. in a metaphysical sense, when we're talking about the nature of reality, there's reality, and that's all there is. If you're talking about a mind or a human being, a consciousness grasping the facts of reality, what they're grasping are the facts. And that's what there is to be grasped. But that doesn't, I said you can go too far. So it's not that, on the one hand, it's not that philosophy deals with some kind of separate world. And it's a from objectivism perspective, it's a major error to think that it's dealing with some kind of separate world, not the world of day-to-day existence that we live in and that we get up and eat breakfast and go to work and so on. No, philosophy, it's deals with the lofty and the noble, and that carries you to somewhere else. And so the objectivism rejects that. And we're going to talk about that in some detail next week, and various, from objectivism's perspective, various errors that come from that. But on the other hand, any principle or idea, even when it's that's claiming to be true, is something. It's not just the equivalent of the facts. What it is a grasp of those facts. And from that perspective, there's no difference between saying, well, look, the fact of gravity exists, but when you get to a Newton in science who develops a whole theory about grasping the fact of gravity and understanding how it works and its ramifications, so that's something new that has never existed before, and now a mind is bringing it into existence. But what it is, if it really is truth, or if it counts as knowledge, it's a grasp of facts. And the same is true if go before you brought up before Ayn Rand. Well, if Aristotle grasped in some form that there's a law of identity, well, the law of identity existed, and that A is A, or a thing is itself, that was true before Aristotle grasped it and formulated a principle and thought of it as a base and an axiom and so that. But nevertheless, when he formulates that, you have something new created. And now you can talk about, well, there's an Aristotelian philosophy, and that is different than just the facts being out there. But this is to be consistent in this, and to always view knowledge as just, it's a grasp of reality, and to have a proper notion of reality. That is a complicated philosophical issue. And what we read next time, we'll read some of what Ayn Rand says about this, that yeah, there is a perspective from which you can say the abstractions don't exist, but what that means is they don't exist in a world unto themselves. From another perspective, they clearly exist when they're created and formulated by a mind. Okay, there's been some in the chat. Who are the protagonists of the Enlightenment is one of the questions. Well, in philosophical terms, I think the central thinker that will be widely recognized as at the heart of the Enlightenment, crucial to the American achievement, so the American political achievement and the founding of America, is John Locke. There are other positive thinkers in the Enlightenment period, or leading up to the Enlightenment period. So there's thinkers in the political tradition that Locke is in, people like Hugo Grotius, Pufendorf, and others who are developing a perspective on rights and a rethinking of government. There's in an approach to knowledge and the importance of science and of an inductive focus, there's Francis Bacon. And again, this is in at the level just talking of philosophers. And then there are mixed cases. I even think someone like David Hume, though philosophically it's the beginning of the end of the Enlightenment, many of his sort of lesser ideas, I think the essence of his philosophy is a type of skepticism that is alien to the Enlightenment. Aspects of his philosophy, such as his challenging of religion and of religious arguments, are important to the project of the Enlightenment. And then there are lesser thinkers, in the sense, lesser just means here from a philosophical perspective. They're not putting forth major new ideas in philosophy in the way that I think Locke is, but yet still doing important philosophical work, pushing the whole project of the Enlightenment and pushing a pro-reason attitude. And these would be, so it's the French term of philosophe, but this would include people like Voltaire and Diderot, so the encyclopedists in France, who are about advancing knowledge, making knowledge more systematic, pro-science. So that there's a whole, I mean, the Enlightenment is a whole intellectual period with many figures in it, moving in the direction of trying to be pro-reason, pro-science, pro the individual, and with a renewed focus on this world and that happiness is possible in this world. So there's a host of figures, but those are some, I think, of the important figures. And then there's, of course, the American founding fathers, who are part of the Enlightenment tradition and an important part as well. Okay, I'm going to take one more and then continue with some further points. And keep in mind that the questions that you're raising here and that I'm not able to get to, you obviously should feel free to raise them in the discussion sessions on Thursday. And particularly, you can think more about it. You might want to formulate the question a little bit differently. And this is part of why we're having ample time for questions and for discussion and further probing of some of these issues. Oh yeah, so the issue of common sense, let me just take that up briefly because we're going to come back to that. There is a perspective on thinking about objectivism and at least some of its basic principles as their common sense. And you can have that same perspective on Aristotle's philosophy, that they're common sense. But I think no philosophical principle is common sense. That is, the explicit formulation of a philosophical principle is extremely uncommon. Very few people can do it. And you can look back on Aristotle's achievement and say of various of his principles, such as, for instance, the issue of the law of identity. Well, that a thing is itself, and you don't have quite the formulation of it that you get in objectivism, I think, in Aristotle, but you get a perspective on that there is identity. And there's a perspective you can have on that is, yeah, everybody already knew this. And they knew it implicitly, but they don't know it explicitly. And that difference really matters. And we'll come back to this because it's important for thinking about what is philosophy. And as I said, one of the major topics to talk about is, you can say, we're studying objectivism. I wanted to say a few things about what objectivism is. So what it is that we're studying, and you can have different perspectives on it. But what objectivism is, the first way of putting it was, it's Ayn Rand's philosophy. It's the name of her philosophy. So then there's a question of, well, what is a philosophy? And I want to talk about that. And this issue of common sense, I think, is important to thinking about philosophy in general and objectivism in particular. So we'll come back to that issue. Okay, so let me now get out of this, what I'm going to call the Q&A mode or the discussion mode, and go back a little bit more into lecture mode. And I said I wanted to say one more thing in regard to objectivism, and this is the issue about what is an objectivist. The simplest way, I think, of thinking of it is it's somebody who has some awareness of Ayn Rand's philosophy and self-identifies as an adherent or a follower or something like that of the philosophy. But that doesn't tell you very much. And this is the point that this is the reason I'm raising it, that you should be conscious of the fact that in and of itself, this label doesn't tell you very much. Either when someone self-identifies as an objectivist or someone calls somebody else, well, he's an objectivist. So it doesn't actually tell you very much. Because there's various dimensions or axes that you could think about and wonder, so where does the person fall on this? So I said, I think to call someone an objectivist requires some awareness of Ayn Rand's philosophy. If he's really never even heard that Ayn Rand has a philosophy, it doesn't make any sense that a person would be self-identifying as an objectivist. He wouldn't even know what it is that he's self-identifying with. But I've met people who they've read something about, well, Ayn Rand is pro-capitalist. And I think of myself as pro-capitalist, so I guess I'm an objectivist. So he knows a little bit about the philosophies and is self-identifying with it. But then he finds out about other aspects of it, and he either doesn't understand them or doesn't agree with them. So that there's a lot of variation of just how much of the philosophy is a person aware of, even when they self-identify as it with the philosophy. Then there's a question of, even if they're aware of a fair amount, how much of it do they understand? And there can be big variations in regard to that. How much do they agree with? So you can understand the philosophy and disagree with it. You can understand Marx's philosophy. You can understand Marxism and reject it. So it's not just an issue of understanding, but when someone's self-identifying, it means some kind of agreement. But to what extent? So I've met people who call themselves Christian objectivists, which means they accept some of the principles of objectivism, but reject others if they understand what they're trying to do and how they're trying to label themselves. So there's an issue of how much you agree and whether there's things that you don't agree with in regard to objectivism. And then there's an important axis of how much is the person actually trying to practice it? So then this goes back to how Ayn Rand thought of philosophy of her philosophy informally. It's a philosophy for living on Earth. So and her whole orientation to ideas and abstract ideas and philosophical ideas is that these ideas are meant to be practiced. So a real question in regard specifically about objectivists is, how much are they actually trying to practice and live the philosophy? And that can vary to a great deal. That you can have people who they talk a lot about the philosophy, but if you ask, are they really trying to implement it in their own lives? I'm not really sure that that's a focus. And then even if they are trying to practice it, there's a question of, are they practicing it properly or successfully? Or are they going wrong in all kinds of ways in trying to practice it? And there's all these kinds of differences. And the label objectivist is tossed around, and it often is referring to very different kinds of things and kinds of people. And in Ayn Rand's time, I think part of the reason, I think this came up on the chat as well, I think Jennifer put it, student of objectivism. Ayn Rand used to insist that people, when you start clubs that and things like that, kind of a little more formal organization of an interest in objectivism, that you describe yourself as a student of objectivism. And I think precisely for this kind of reason, that there's all these dimensions and axes that are at play, and she doesn't want it confused with, she has a view as the originator or creator of the philosophy. This is what the philosophy means, and this is what it looks like to practice it. And you can have many people who don't understand what it means, or don't fully understand what it means, or don't understand the whole system, and that they're either not trying to practice it or practice it in very different ways, or going wrong in trying to practice it, and so. And she didn't want to be associated with all of that. The reason I'm bringing it up here, one, from the perspective of the course, I think of it as, yeah, what we all are here are students of objectivism. We're trying to understand, and the essence of what we're trying to do is understand what the philosophy is, which then will put you in a position to think about, do I agree with it or not? And part of that agreement is when we're talking about, do we understand the philosophy, we should be talking about, and I will try to be talking about this, and in the discussion sessions, this should be a point to think about as well, of what does it mean to practice this? And in the end, I think from Ayn Rand's perspective, to agree with the philosophy is to think of it as true, and therefore you want to practice it. And that is, I don't attach much importance to the issue of, is someone an objectivist or not? And it's never at the forefront of my mind in talking, meeting new people, talking to people, and so it's, I'm interested, I'm a philosopher, I'm interested in what people think philosophically and what they think is true and what principles they think are correct, and then how, if and how they're trying to actually live those principles. And if in the end one comes to think that objectivism is partly or essentially true, that's what you're interested in the end. It should be, is this knowledge? And to the extent it is, I'm trying to incorporate it into my life, and to the extent that I think it's not, then I'm going to adopt different ideas or different principles. And another way of putting this, I don't think one's identity should be wrapped up in the idea, am I an objectivist or not? To the extent that you're thinking of that in terms of an identity, it's much more, it should be, do I think of my self-identity as I'm interested in truth and knowledge, not am I an objectivist or not? And part of the reason I'm bringing this up, or really the essence of the reason I'm bringing this up, is I think this is one of the reasons why people don't ask enough questions about objectivism and about what Ayn Rand is writing or arguing, and being willing to say, look, I don't find this convincing, or I'm not sure I agree with this, or is this really a good argument, or just, I don't understand what she's talking about here. It's not clear to me. I don't get it. Or I have doubts about this, or there's something plausible about this, but I'm not certain this is right. All of this, I think, should be a regular occurrence in thinking about objectivism or any other philosophy, or indeed any system of abstract ideas and principles. A lot goes into the argument and the case for abstract principles, and you need to think carefully about, like, is this good argument? Is this a good case? Is it fully convincing? Or maybe it's, yeah, there's reason to think this is likely, this is probable, but I'm not yet convinced. I don't regard this yet as a certainty. And most people, I think in today's culture, most people's comparison for philosophy is religion. What is most akin to philosophy is religion. And a religion you're supposed to swallow without asking too many questions or expressing doubts about things. Because it's really, you're doubting this, but you're supposed to follow it and you're supposed to do it. And religion will often beat down on you. Why are you asking questions about this? Why are you're supposed to follow, obey. You're supposed to agree without having too much or any argument. And philosophy is not like that at all. I think a proper conception of philosophy is divorcing itself from religion, and that's certainly true of objectivism in particular. It's supposed to be giving arguments, it's supposed to be advancing evidence, and it, certainly from objectivism's perspective, it knows reaching knowledge is a complicated endeavor. You don't just go from 0 to 1 to being completely ignorant and now I know everything. There's a long process of acquiring knowledge. And that's true of any real theory, and it's true of philosophical theories, and it's true of objectivism. And so you should never feel like you have to toe the party line, as you can easily feel in religion. Like, I'm having doubts, but I'm not supposed to express them. I'm not supposed to ask questions. I'm supposed to act like I agree with everything and follow. And that's not how one should be oriented to philosophy in general or objectivism in particular. What you should have, and what Ayn Rand stresses in philosophical detection, now she's stressing it more from the negative perspective, but you can put it in a more neutral or positive perspective. What you should be is active-minded. But the norm when you're active-minded is that you have a lot of questions and a lot of follow-up, and like, what is being said exactly here? And I'm not sure I get that, or I agree with that. So that's what it looks like, in part at least, to have an active mind. And I think the tendency, again, this is a tendency, so it's not, I don't want to paint with too broad a brushstroke or paint everyone that it's like this. But a tendency in objectivism is to be self-critical about other people and other viewpoints, and not be self-critical about objectivism and my own views and my own understanding and so on. And to have an active mind is to be critical and probing and questioning about both of those. I'll give you, I often give this as an example, but I think it is a good example, and it actually touches on some of what I brought up before. So there's many objectivists, and I'm one of them, who get annoyed or more than annoyed when you meet critics of Ayn Rand who say, well, she's all about, it's a dog-eat-dog world, and it's the really intelligent and the elites, they rise to the top, and she couldn't care about anybody else. And so, and then you ask, well, what have you read of Ayn Rand's that's leading you to this? Oh, I haven't read anything, but this is what I've heard. And you get like, no, this is not the way to form a conclusion about someone. But that same phenomenon exists within the objectivist world, and one should be as critical of it when it exists in the objectivist world as when it is opponents of objectivism. So I brought up Kant, and I mentioned that Ayn Rand talks about Kant a lot. And I have a certain view that he's the philosopher who brings an end to the Enlightenment. He's the first philosopher who really turns against the Enlightenment. There's arguments in objectivism that he helps pave the way, or he's the major force paving the way for the rise of Nazism in Germany and more broadly, totalitarianism. So whether you're talking about Nazism or communism in the West, Ayn Rand called him the most evil person in the world. But you can't just repeat these things because, well, this is part of objectivism and I'm supposed to repeat these things and I'm a follower and an adherent. And then if someone asks, okay, so you're saying Kant is the father of Nazism or the most evil person in the world. What have you read of Kant? And if the answer is nothing, then it's, well, isn't that about the same as the people who are attacking Ayn Rand without having really studied or read anything, let alone studied what her philosophy amounts to? And there's many things like that in the objectivist world that it's not self-critical and self-searching enough. And I think there's a reason for it, that if you have a wrong approach to philosophy, it can be threatening to do that, particularly when you start self-identifying as an objectivist. Then to bring up, well, I'm not sure about this, and I'm not sure I agree with this, and I don't know if I have any argument for this point. So it's a point that Ayn Rand makes, and she thinks is true, but I'm not sure I'm even in a position to think whether it's true or not, because I'm not even sure I'm getting the point and what the argument for the point is, let alone do I find this argument convincing. So, and all of that you should be willing to do, and we should be willing to do in the course if what we're really trying to do is understand objectivism and get a deeper perspective on what it is. Okay, so that's the essence of what I wanted to talk about in regard to objectivism and objectivists and the issue of self-identifying as an objectivist. Let me now say a few words about the whole subject of philosophy and then particularly objectivism's perspective on philosophy. The question, what is philosophy, is itself a philosophical question, I think. It's one of the interesting, or one of the many interesting aspects of philosophy. Philosophy, part of what it does is define the very subject that it is. And this is a perspective that you get in objectivism, but I don't think it's unique to objectivism. It's that philosophy is the foundation or base or starting point or spring for systematic investigation of the world. And when you look at ancient Greece, what you get when we're thinking of the first philosophers, it's hard to distinguish them from the first scientists. Someone like Thales, who is often identified as the first philosopher in the Western world. So he's ancient Greece, pre-Plato, pre-Aristotle. He's famous for the idea that everything is made of water. And he has some arguments for why he thinks that. And that can at once be looked at as this is trying to get and argue for an account or picture, using that metaphorically, a picture of the basic nature of the world. Everything's made of water and it shifts in terms of form that it can take and so on. In the way that water can, it can freeze and become ice. But you can look at it as it's an account of giving a basic nature of reality. But at this level, there's no real dividing between, like, is this a scientific account or is this a philosophical account? And the term that is often used is they're natural philosophers. They're thinkers looking at the natural world and trying to get its basic nature or start to define its basic principles. And it's only a fairly, I mean, from one perspective, a fairly long train of thinkers. From another perspective, when you're looking sort of at the flow of history, it's a very short period of time from getting from Thales to someone like Plato. But I think of it as the perspective on philosophy that you get in objectivism, and that we're getting in philosophy who needs it, that there's branches and they're interconnected. This is, and it's a separate subject. So she is in part of what we're read for today. She's making it, Ayn Rand is making a distinction between philosophy and the specialized sciences. So that philosophy is its own subject and it has its own subject matter. That, to even get to that perspective, is an enormous feat of abstraction, I think. And it took, I think it comes into the Western mind with Socrates and Plato. And it's hard to make too much of a distinction between Socrates and Plato, at least the earlier Plato, because much of what we know about Socrates is from Plato's writings, and it's hard to know, is he just reporting Socrates' views, or is he couching them in his own whole perspective? In this context, I'm treating them as sort of going together and as a unit. It's at that point that you get the idea that there's questions here that are interconnected and that are important to life and to the living of life. So I think of Ayn Rand's perspective on philosophy as very much the ancient Greek perspective, but particularly the perspective that comes with Socrates and Plato. And if you think of the essay Philosophy, Who Needs It? I think there's two major points being made in that essay. And these are points that I think are discovered in the end by Socrates and Plato. And I would put it as what Ayn Rand's arguing in Philosophy, Who Needs It? Is that philosophy is important and it's inescapable. And another way to encapsulate that is, for good or ill, philosophical abstractions shape a life. And you could have either of these points. It's the combination that is what is really interesting about philosophy. So you could say, look, medicine's important, but it's not inescapable in the sense that everybody has views about medicine. And you could say something's inescapable, but it's not important. And it's not important to focus on. So you could say, well, it's inescapable that we all take up physical space. Is that something important to focus on? And what Ayn Rand is arguing about philosophy is it's inescapable. So part of what she's arguing in Philosophy, Who Needs It? Is everyone in some sense has philosophical ideas and cannot help but have philosophical ideas. And that it's important to really think about these issues. And that's the perspective that you get with Socrates and Plato. So, and particularly if you focus on Socrates and what are called the early Platonic dialogues, so the early dialogues of Plato. What you see is Socrates going around talking to Athenians, so the people of Athens, about how they really have certain assumptions and premises guiding their actions, even when they don't realize it or wouldn't recognize it and couldn't explicitly formulate it. So that the dialogues center around questions like, what is justice? Or what is piety, which is mean like, so what is the right relationship to have towards the gods? Or what is courage? And so this is a point that Ayn Rand makes in fictional terms about the astronaut landing on a distant planet, and that he would have to ask himself in some terms, where am I? How can I discover it? What should I do? And the point of the fictional story, I think, is precisely to put him on an alien planet where it's like, where am I? The answer to that's not obvious. What should I do? Should I stay in my spaceship? Should I wander out? That's not obvious. How do I decide? That's not obvious in the context. I mean, that's, I think, the point of why she's using a fictional example. And then she says, I mean, she gives some more detail about that example, that one faces these same questions on the planet that one happens to inhabit, which is your life on Earth. Yet the tendency is to think one already knows the answers to these questions. So this is what she writes. By the time they are old enough to understand these questions, men believe that they know the answers. Where am I? Say, in New York City. How do I know it? It's self-evident. What should I do? Here they are not too sure, but the usual answer is whatever everybody does. The only trouble seems to be that they are not very active, not very confident, not very happy, and they experience at times a causeless fear and an undefined guilt, which they cannot explain or get rid of. Close quote. And that part of the real discovery of philosophy, and I think part of the importance of this essay, Philosophy Who Needs It, in understanding Ayn Rand's view and perspective on philosophy, is precisely this, that there's certain questions that are real questions, that are inescapable, that you end up formulating some kind of answer to, that you're often not even aware that you really have an answer to these questions. And you're certainly not aware of, is this a good answer or not? And this is exactly what happens if you read some of the Socratic dialogues of Plato. He goes around, like, what is justice? And people have, justice is giving people what they deserve. And then he asks some other questions, like, so does it mean this, this, and this? And it's at once you get the perspective on, yeah, people act as if they know the answer to the question, what is justice? They have law courts and political systems and views about what's right and what's wrong in their society. And so from some perspective, they have an answer to this, and they're acting as though they have answer to the question, well, what is justice? And yet when you ask them, what's the answer? They can say something, but it's not very convincing, and you can easily get them to the point of thinking, yeah, this isn't exactly convincing, and I don't know exactly why I even think this, and what argument that I would give for this. And that is the perspective, I think, that objectivism has on philosophy. But you should not be too easily convinced of this perspective, I think. So this is a radical perspective. It's a radical perspective to think that everybody has a philosophy, whether they know it or not. And in thinking about that, part of what one should think about, I think, is what is the evidence that Ayn Rand is giving for thinking that everybody has an implicit philosophy? And then it's what do I think of that evidence, or so do I think it's good evidence? Is it enough evidence? Would I have to think more about this? Are there other kinds of considerations to bring up? And just to hint at thinking about this, one of the reasons I asked you to read, in addition to Philosophy Who Needs, to the lead essay, Philosophy Who Needs It, the essay from the Romantic Manifesto, Philosophy and Sense of Life. I think if you asked Ayn Rand the question, so in Philosophy Who Needs It, that is, again, when I'm using Philosophy Who Needs It, I'm talking about the essay in the book. In Philosophy Who Needs It, have you given all your reasons for thinking that everyone has an implicit philosophy? I think her answer to that would be no. I've not. I've indicated some of the things that I think are relevant for thinking that philosophy is inescapable. But there's many more things to think about, and there's many other considerations that go into my view that everybody, there's a sense in which everybody has a philosophy. And I want to talk about that, but now I've gone on now for another about 25 minutes or so. So I want to pause here. But let's put on the table the way I think Ayn Rand thinks of the structure of philosophy, just so in case there's people want to discuss that as well. So she gives us, as I read from Philosophy Who Needs It, sort of three central questions, and these are the questions that the astronaut would face. Where am I? How can I discover it? What should I do? If you expand that a little bit, and to get, I think, the way Objectivism's thinking of the structure of philosophy, and that there's some sense in which people have something like this implicitly without really knowing it, but it's there and it's operative. You have two big questions. Where am I and what am I? So where am I? What am I? That lead to the question, what should I do? So you can think of it as, given where I am and what I am, what should I do? So it's where am I, what should I do? And then there's a sort of derivative question, but this is part of why Objectivism thinks of politics as a derivative issue. Under the what should I do, there's an important question of how, if at all, should society be organized? Or should I organize myself with others into a society? But it's where am I, what am I, which leads to the question, or given some kind of views on those of where I am and what I am, what I should do, and then a derivative of should I organize into a political system. And there's, as she puts it in the essay, there's a kind of corollary question for all of these, but that's why there's sort of where am I, what should I do? And a corollary question is, how do I know it? Like, how do I know any of these things? How do I know where I am? How do I know what I am? How do I know what should I do? But it's a corollary for all of these. there's always a follow-up question. How do you know it? And then there's a kind of question at the bottom, which is, does philosophy need art? Which is a question that's not exactly like the others. And again, in thinking of having an active mind, so I pointed out in one of Ayn Rand's summaries of her own philosophy, she doesn't even mention aesthetics. In Philosophy Who Needs It, she mentions it, but it should strike you as the way she mentions it is not similar to the other to the other branches of philosophy. So she mentions metaphysics, and then she talks about, like, these are some of the questions metaphysics addresses. And then there's a corollary, which is epistemology, so theory of knowledge. So metaphysics is the where am I, the basic nature of reality. There's a corollary, how do I know it? That's what epistemology is, theory of knowledge. And then she talks about some of the, do I acquire knowledge by sense perception? Can I be certain? And questions of that nature. When she gets to aesthetics, that's not what you get. So to read, so there's one paragraph, and this is what it is. The fifth and last branch of philosophy is aesthetics, the study of art, which is based on metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Art deals with the needs, the refueling of man's consciousness. That's it. And then it goes on from there. Why is that? Like, why, if this essay is about philosophy who needs it, and we're talking about the branches of philosophy, and you're saying aesthetics is a branch of philosophy, why this kind of description, and we don't get the questions, and why is it exactly a branch of philosophy? And would the astronaut have to ask himself, what is art when he crash lands on the planet? And she doesn't bring up aesthetics when it's this again. If you're reading and not just taking, well, this is what Ayn Rand says, let me go to the next point. And if you're really trying to grapple and think about it, this is a question I think for sure one should have in reading this essay. Why exactly is aesthetics a branch of philosophy? Why is it treated differently? It doesn't show up with the astronaut story. And so these are things that if you're really trying to understand objectivism, these are the kinds of questions that one should be asking oneself. Now we're going to also, so part of the exercises in the class are, we're going to ask you questions, but we also want you to raise questions. And it's part to get into the habit of asking questions about objectivism and about Ayn Rand's arguments and what she's saying, and not just taking it as, well, this must be true because Ayn Rand's saying it. Okay, sorry, I was trying to make a quick point, which wasn't that quick. But let me pause here and again, for some either questions, some further elaboration, discussion of so we're getting a perspective on philosophy, as I was saying, that it's important and inescapable. And part of what inescapable means is everyone has it in some kind of sense. And then we're going to talk about some of the evidence that Ayn Rand advances for that view. But that's the picture that objectivism is painting about philosophy. And it goes into the issue of why it's relevant for everyone, because she thinks, well, everyone has it in some kind of way already. So questions, comments, follow up on that. And let me try to see if there's things coming up in the chat. So there's some questions in the chat about aesthetics. And we will come back to that in the end of the course to talk a little bit about aesthetics. But so it's a question I've raised that we're not going to get to for a long time, but it's something to think about. It's not at all obvious, I think, that aesthetics is a branch of philosophy, and in what way it's a branch even. Yeah, someone's asking, is there a hand raising button? I don't see that there is one for now. We're not using the Zoom webinars, but you can unmute and just ask a question.
Then I'll ask a question.
Great.
One thing that I did not find very convincing in Philosophy Who Needs It was the idea that we're not choosing abstract principles. At least I think that there are some that maybe wouldn't be escapable, but some that could be. I can imagine a grown adult who can convince themselves to act like the infant who encounters things for the first time. And one of the things that makes me think of that would be like a skeptic or an absurdist. And they train their mind to be like, well, no, I can't assume, if I drop this, it might fly upward. And so I think you can kind of put a stopper at some point. And I know that in Philosophical Detection, Rand also says something along the lines of, you become mentally passive and merely react to events or merely feel. And so to me, that seems like, if she's saying that seems to contradict or complicate her original idea that, well, you're just going to have really complex thoughts about things all the time. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes. Yeah, no, I think those are good things to ask and to think about and pay attention to. I don't think she's arguing that everyone has a philosophy in the sense of an abstract system. Even if you mean an abstract kind of systematic that's more implicit, the person couldn't articulate, but it's operative in some sense. And I think, so it's not that you could go around and talking about people as, well, he's an implicit Marxist, and he's an implicit Hegelian, and he's an implicit Kantian, and he's an implicit Aristotelian, and he's an implicit Platonist. I don't think that's what she means. And I think it would be wrong if that is what is being argued or claimed. So the description in Philosophy Who Needs It is, I will talk a little, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I think it's important just to pay attention to the way she describes it. As a human being, so I'm quoting, as a human being, you have no choice about the fact that you need a philosophy. Your only choice is whether you define your philosophy by a conscious, rational, disciplined process of thought and scrupulously logical deliberation, or let your subconscious accumulate a junk heap of unwarranted conclusions, false generalizations, undefined contradictions, undigested slogans, unidentified wishes, doubts, and fears, thrown together by chance, but integrated by your subconscious into a kind of mongrel philosophy. And then it goes and fused into a single solid weight self-doubt. But I think that this description of unwarranted conclusions, false generalizations, undefined contradictions, undigested slogans, unidentified wishes, that is somehow put together into a mongrel philosophy. That's important for how she's thinking about the phenomenon. So it's that a person has a certain abstract perspectives on life that are operative and that have some connection to each other, but not at all a systematic, integrated connection. If one's thinking of logical integration, of an attempt to put this all together, to make it all make sense, to try to find, well, here's inconsistencies or contradictions that I need to, nothing like that happens. So it's a whole bunch of contradictions, things that if you brought both to bear and looked at them simultaneously, is like, they both can't be true. Something's weird here. It's just a person has a heap that becomes connected a bit, but not in the way that one thinks of what a philosopher is trying to do. And what a philosopher is trying to do I'm abstracting away from whether one thinks the philosophy is true or not. So I don't think Marxism is true, but it's an integrated perspective on the world, on life, and so on. And I don't think that, she's not saying that that's what people have, but they have something like that. And I think that's relevant then for thinking of the evidence that she brings up for thinking that people have this, that we'll talk about.
Hey, Onkar, there is a hand-raising feature, and if you go into the participants list, you can see people at the top of the list who've raised their hand. And there are 2 people right now.
Great, yes. So I don't have the feature, but okay, great. Yeah, so what time is it? So we're a little, okay, yeah, let's take 2 more. So there's Stephanie and then Jerry. I'm most likely going to mangle a lot of names, so tell me if I mangle your name.
You didn't mangle it. I was testing to see if you could see the hand raised.
I couldn't, but Ben
I
did.
also have a comment about that section you were reading in Philosophy Who Needs It. And it goes on, she goes on and gives a whole long list, several paragraphs worth of examples, because people say, well, I don't want to deal with the theory and the philosophy. I just want to be real and concrete. And she goes, well, did you ever say this? Did you ever say that? You got that from so-and-so. You got that from somebody else. Everything that people use to guide their lives is coming from some philosopher, some piece of crap that they're using to guide themselves, you know, if it's not objectivism. So I thought it's a really good passage to read the whole thing of.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about that, because I think that is a way of thinking of the kind of evidence that she's bringing up and asking one to think about in thinking about the idea of whether people have implicit philosophical views. So for sure, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I would name that as, that's a major part of the evidence she's bringing up.
And why I don't often have questions.
Okay, so we have Jerry.
Yeah, actually, I was just playing with the feature. I was trying to find, you know, where the raise hand symbol is. So I didn't have a question, but now I have actually. I'm storing the questions for Thursday. But while I'm on, why don't I ask the question that I could be asking Thursday now? I remember once hearing Leonard Peikoff something about polemics, that one should not be primarily focused on polemics. That sort of puzzled me, but I did understand that one should be focused on understanding ideas and not sort of be bothered with every critic and spending, you know, their time with answering all kinds of questions. And I understand that, but I still always thought that to communicate with people, one has to understand their viewpoints, and one has to spend time on taking their ideas, their questions seriously. Okay. And so I was very much happy hearing you, Onkar, last time on the at the orientation, explicitly mentioning this, that you know, this is not just this course, and the whole subject or taking philosophy seriously does not only mean studying objectivism or studying philosophy for oneself, but also trying to understand others, how they think, what questions they raise, you know, depending on, you know, whether they're serious at all. Otherwise, you know, there's nothing to communicate. There's no one to communicate with when you don't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. So I was very pleased to hear this from you. Thanks.
Yeah, let me make a, thank you, and let me make a couple comments about that. there's a difference between polemics and contrast. So the contrast is, I'm saying I'm an advocate of selfishness. And I don't mean by that, so I certainly don't mean that your whole life is about serving other people, sacrificing your own interest and happiness, giving up your time, money, so for the sake of other people and other people who happen to be around. I don't mean that when I'm talking about selfishness, but I also don't mean a viewpoint that, as Ayn Rand would often put it, means the sacrifice of others to self. What I mean by selfishness is a non-sacrificial approach to life. And that's, in making your point, you're contrasting it to other points to make it clear what you're arguing and maintaining, and making it clear what you're not arguing and maintaining. You often do that, and I would not put that as polemics. Polemics is when you're trying to refute a wrong view. There can be occasions to do that, but in communication, you often have to establish the whole context, how your view relates to other views, so a person can get, okay, this is where you're coming from, and you're not advocating this, and you're not advocating this, but you're advocating this, and this is how you think it relates. So in communication, contrast is almost always necessary at some point. In comparison and contrast is necessary at some point. The point about polemics is that it's not a primary, and I think you said Dr. Peikoff made this point, but it's, he got it from Ayn Rand, and he actually, I mean, one of the places you can see her formulate is what I read from a brief summary. She said her primary concern is not to engage in polemics. And that was not her primary concern, because she thinks any time your primary concern is with polemics, there's something fundamentally wrong about your orientation. That your primary should be a concern with what's true and good. And the corollary, but it's only a corollary and a secondary issue. It's then, if you've identified this is true and this is good, then you're opposed to what's false. So what departs from the truth, and you're opposed to what's evil, but that means which departs and contradicts and stands in opposition to what is good. And the primary and the much more difficult task, but the primary task is to establish, well, what is true and what is good. And then it's a derivative issue of, well, then there's errors, falsehoods, deliberate falsehoods, there's evil, and so, and you do not establish a positive view by knocking down a negative view. And that's why it can never be a primary. Even if you have a refutation of Kant's views, that does not say that the Enlightenment approach is right. They might both be wrong. So you can establish a positive by not knocking down a negative. Now, there's some caveats in regard to that in very specialized contexts, but the norm is not, okay, I know one of these three views is right. Well, I can show A is wrong and B is wrong, so I guess C is right. You're almost never in that context. You first need to think, was A, B, or C right? And then it's, okay, I've got real reasons to think B is right, and therefore, there's reasons to think A and C are wrong. So she was adamant, and I think rightly so, that a polemical orientation indicates something really off about how you're thinking about the subject in philosophy or anywhere else. I mean, physics isn't primarily about refuting wrong views in physics. It's about establishing what is true. And the same should be your orientation in philosophy. Okay, I want to go on to talk about two other issues. So one, the continuation of some of the evidence that she's advancing for her view of philosophy, and also then a little bit about arguments against philosophy. So one of the things that was mentioned when we were just talking about in our discussion in the more Q&A is she brings up what she calls catchphrases, and that everybody makes use of these catchphrases. I think that's part of the point. So catchphrases like nobody can be certain of anything, nobody's perfect, things like that. She brings these up, that these part of that they're catchphrases is that they're regularly in use. They're almost bromides in that sense. They're abstract formulations, and she views them, I think, as their philosophical formulations. Why are they philosophical formulations? And how do they function? What is it that they're doing when someone advances these things? And I put it like this, and that this is really what philosophy is about. They're providing a framework from which to look at the world. And they're supposed to be ultimate justification. That is, you don't have to go beyond them. You don't have to analyze them, think more about it. It's what they're in effect saying, this is the way the world is, but I'm including by this is the way people are, live with it. So it's, nobody's perfect in this world. So what are you going to do? And it's supposed to be a stopping point or the end to the debate, the reasoning. It's now we've got a justification for, okay, yeah, I guess nobody's perfect. So what are you going to do? Nobody can be certain. So what's the point of trying to figure this out? We can't figure it out. Or you can't reach certainty in regard to it, at least. And that's it. It's the end of the discussion. It's the end of the analysis, because you're supposedly, at least, what you've reached is something fundamental or basic about the structure of the world and your life in the world. And the fact that these are regularly in use and they're used in this kind of way, I think she's taking as this is what it looks like for someone to have an abstract perspective on things that they could not really articulate. It doesn't form some big system. They couldn't defend. They probably couldn't even say, like, where did you get this idea? I mean, this is one of the points that comes in philosophy, who needs it in philosophical detection. They use it, where did they get it from? Well, they got it from certain thinkers who formulated worldviews and philosophies from which this is like a pithy encapsulation of an aspect of it. And now people make use of that, and they make use of it to make sense of their lives and what they're doing and what other people are doing and what you should do, without recognizing that these are in effect philosophical ideas, because they're ideas that pertain to the kinds of questions that Ayn Rand raised about. These are things that metaphysics deals with. What kind of world do I live in? Is it intelligible? Can I reach knowledge about it? Can I achieve certainty in regard to facts of reality? How do I if I can, how do I reach certain? What is the path to that? And including things, what is possible to human beings? which, for instance, the issue of perfection is part of what is going on, whether anyone can be perfect or not. It's a lot about your conception of what a human being is, and also a conception of what perfection is. But she's taking this as a sample of what it looks like when people are making use of very abstract ideas and the way that they make use of it, why they do, and the kind of function that it's serving in life. And I think what she's suggesting is, if you look at people and how they function, you'll see this kind of thing repeatedly. And this is an important point. I think this is a wider point about philosophy, and I think about how to think about philosophy and objectivism's perspective on philosophy, and of what you're getting in objectivism. I put it like this. Philosophy is a promissory note. So part of what is strange about the subject is it's needed when you're young. And this is a point that Ayn Rand stresses, and it's part of why I asked you to read the essay Philosophy and Sense of Life. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because it's more of the kind of evidence that I think she's asking you to think about. Philosophy of Sense of Life is stressing that these what Ayn Rand is calling philosophical questions arise when you're a teenager in late adolescence, when you're thinking about your life and your life as a sort of as a whole, as a journey, and what is going to be my orientation and what am I going to go after. It's natural for these questions to come up, given the development of a human mind in a civilized context, that is, in the context of a civilized society. I think she's thinking of it as. It's natural for them to come up, but if one asks, what is the data of philosophy? It's not a specialized science for Ayn Rand. Part of what that means is it's pre the specialized sciences. The specialized sciences branch off from philosophy, which is what I think happened when one thinks of the discovery of science in ancient Greece. First, it's just sort of natural philosophers. We deal with the big abstract questions. And then you later get, well, you can parcel things out. Like, this is more biology and this is medicine. But that's a later development. It's first like we're acquiring abstract knowledge. And that's what we're doing. It's an abstract perspective on life. That's part of how she's thinking about it. Specialized sciences come later. It has no specialized observations of its own. You don't have to go into the lab and put tissues under a microscope or catalog if you're doing astronomy, of the movement of the stars for 5 years before you can even start speculating about like how are there patterns to the movement and how should we think about this and so on. All kinds of the specialized sciences, part of what makes them specialized is they require specialized observations. That's not how Ayn Rand thinks about philosophy, and I think this again is similar to the Plato-Socratic kind of perspective. It's you meet the issues of philosophy in the living of life, but yet there's still data. There's no specialized data. But there's still data. And the data, I think the way Ayn Rand thinks about it is, the data is the observations that you make in living. And that you make, I think as she would put it, qua man. So not qua any specialized field, I'm an engineer or an astrophysicist or a doctor, but just qua human being. The observations that you make throughout life. but it's the observations you make throughout life. And you don't yet have them when you're 16 or 17 years old. And it's an interesting phenomenon, I think, and it will relate to some of what we talk about next time in terms of rationalism. I think in philosophy above all, there's a real tendency towards rationalism for identifiable reasons. And this, I think, is actually one of the reasons. You're being given a worldview when you're exposed to philosophy without yet having the data to decide, that is to decide in a first-handed, logical or rational way, is this view right or not? And I think that's true of objectivism as well. And this is what I mean by philosophy as a promissory note. In effect, what a philosophy is telling you is when you go out in the world, this is what you're going to observe and encounter, and this is how to integrate that. That is, this is how to put it together in a way that makes sense. But you don't yet have that data. And so to say it's a promissory note, this is what you will find if you go out and look and think about these issues and observe carefully. And in the context here, I think that is how to think about when she's arguing that everybody has a philosophy. She's pointing to some things and saying, if you, now with these in mind, if you go out in the world and when you interact with people and you see how people function, look if this is not what you see. That is, that you see that they're making use in a certain way of abstract perspectives and abstract ideas, even if they couldn't articulate it, even if they don't really know that that's what they're doing, but that's actually what they're doing. But to be really convinced of it, you have to go out in the world and think and observe. You need the data that philosophy is trying to integrate. And I think this is an important issue to grasp about philosophy and about objectivism as well. And if you think now to bring in philosophy and sense of life, I think in philosophy of sense of life, you get a deeper perspective on some of the issues raised in philosophy who needs it. So in philosophy who needs it, you're getting some indication of that the way she looks at people is that they have some abstract notions, ideas that are in their minds, even if they're not fully conscious of it, they couldn't articulate them, but they sometimes give voice to them in such as these kinds of catchphrases that they make use of. They're functioning in a certain kind of way. This is what you observe about people. And in philosophy and sense of life, she thinks there's a deeper phenomena to observe. The way in which she calls a sense of life an implicit metaphysics. And that should remind you, in philosophy who needs it, she's talking about an implicit philosophy. It's something that a person's put together, doesn't even really know, and it's a mongrel philosophy. So I think the idea of a sense of life is a deeper perspective on this. And here too, it should be, is she right that people have a sense of life? Is it right to think that they have an implicit metaphysics? And she points to some reasons of thinking about this, including, importantly, and this is also important in regard to philosophy, including to think introspectively about your own life and functioning and how your mind is working and so on. A part of the idea of a sense of life is a person has a basic orientation to the world, a way of facing the world is one of the ways that Ayn Rand puts it. Is that true? Is that what I observe about myself and about other people? And there's a lot of work that goes into thinking, like even to start to think, is this true or not? It's her perspective on people. And I think the idea of a sense of life is a deeper perspective of what it means to have an implicit philosophy. Other aspects of this, and I've written about this in the companion to Ayn Rand, which is the edited collection of Greg Salmieri and Alan Godhealth put together. It has a little bit more scholarly focus, but it's touching on a lot of the crucial elements of objectivism. She has a notion of a sense of life. She has a notion of self-esteem, and she has a notion of psychoepistemology. And all of these she thinks of as this is a person's implicit habitual functioning. That he has an implicit metaphysics, that he has an implicit moral perspective that is crucial to the whole issue of self-esteem. It's evaluation of yourself and your place in the world, but it's moral evaluation in the end, or at least in an important aspect, is moral evaluation. And psychoepistemology is an implicit epistemology. And these are all, I think they're all complicated notions. We'll talk a little bit, particularly about self-esteem later in the course. But it's a deeper perspective on, I think, why she thinks a person has an implicit philosophy. That they have these implicit elements. They have a sense of life, and they have a self-esteem or a pseudo self-esteem or a lack of self-esteem, but they have some kind of position on it, and it's inescapable that you look at a person and think he's got a strong self-esteem or healthy self-esteem, or he's got a self-esteem but with certain aspects that he has a lot of self-doubt and so on, or he doesn't have any self-esteem at all. She thinks, again, that this is when you look at people and you think about their functions, this is a perspective you would have on them, and about how their mind functions and their habitual ways of thinking, of processing information, of raising objections, and the kind of objections they raise, and the kinds of things when they're thinking about something, like, is this true? Well, what would I think about in thinking about, is this true? What actually goes in their mind? She thinks it's, again, you observe habits, patterns that amount to an implicit epistemology. But this, and this is a very deep perspective on that individual human beings are philosophical, and that they're inherently philosophical beings. And you should not accept this too easily, that this is true of people. It is, I mean, the reason there's a whole book, Philosophy Who Needs It, is that most people disagree with this. So to say that the essay Philosophy Who Needs It, it's about philosophy is important and inescapable. The common view is it's not important, and it's for sure inescapable, because most people don't have a philosophy or any philosophical view or any perspective on philosophy. So this is, it should, in a certain sense, it should be a startling claim. It's certainly a radical claim that most people disagree with it. And it should take a lot to convince you that this is true. And I'm raising some of the things to think about. I'm raising some of what I think she's bringing up in terms of what it would be that you would be observing about people to say, yeah, this is right in terms of their functioning. Okay, let me make two other points. I'll then take a little more questions, and then in the last, so we end at 5:30, some administrative things. And I normally, if we go 2.5 hours, we'll take a break. But now, since we're so close to the end, I'm not going to take a break, but I'm going to not do that in future classes if we go 2.5 hours. So two other points about philosophy. And now it's from the perspective of the arguments against philosophy. I think, so there were three arguments that Dr. Peikoff brings up. You can put it as, and the way that he puts it, philosophy versus self or versus individuality, philosophy versus the rest of the world, or philosophy versus other people, or philosophy versus other people who don't share my philosophy, something like that. So it's philosophy versus, it pits me, it stifles myself or my individuality, it pits me against the world. And the third is, it's useless. I think obviously the strongest is that it's useless. Because who cares if it's useless? Why are you clinging to it? If it then has further negative things, that it pits you against yourself or it pits you against other people, why have that if it's useless? The only time you would think about, okay, well, yeah, it's a problem that it pits me against myself or my individuality, or it pits me against other people and gives rise to some kind of conflict. The only time you would care about that really is, well, but it brings me some benefits. And it has these negatives, and maybe the negatives outweigh the positives. But if it doesn't bring you any benefits, why are you clinging to it? And then if it brings you negatives, it's all the more reason to abandon it. So the crucial issue is it useless? And to answer that, the primary thing to ask oneself is, why do I think it's useful? So you don't start with, well, here's an argument against philosophy. You should start with, what's the case for philosophy? And only if you have a case for philosophy, then should you think about, yeah, but it has some negatives. And how should I consider those? It's like if you're taking a drug, you worry about the side effects only once you're first convinced, yeah, this drug's going to have positive impact on me. And then it's also going to have these side effects. And are these side effects too much? And do they outweigh the positives it's going to bring from taking this drug? But if you have no reason to take the drug in the first place, why are you worrying about side effects? And there's a way in which you can look at the arguments against philosophy from that perspective. And one perspective to have on the course, because of what we're studying is objectivism, and one of the aspects or perspectives to have on what is objectivism that Ayn Rand had is it's a philosophy for living on Earth. So the whole point is these principles are supposed to enable you to achieve positive values. And the only, to be convinced that philosophy is not useless is to be convinced that it brings positive values. And so from a perspective, what we are looking at in the course is the reasons to think, or some of the reasons to think, that objectivism brings positive values, that it helps you achieve the positive. But I want to say, I'm separating out the arguments as philosophy is useless versus the other two, because I think one should have different perspectives on these arguments. I think all of the arguments should have some real plausibility to them. And when you have something as abstract as philosophy, and this is a point Dr. Peikoff in his discussion touches on, which I emphatically agree with. There's a way in which you should think of philosophy as guilty until proven innocent. And this was, arguments against philosophy date back to the discovery of philosophy. So these kind of arguments were made against Socrates, that he's concerned with all these abstract notions that don't make any difference. He's got his head in the clouds. Why isn't he dealing with reality? And Socrates' perspective is, no, I am dealing with reality from a very abstract perspective, but that in the end is how you have to deal with it. So he did not think of a question like, what is justice? As that's for two academics to talk about in their office, and then they go out into the world and do whatever, and what they thought about and talked about and argued about has no impact on what they do and how they think of the world. So he thought of it, and this is Ayn Rand's perspective certainly, it's a very abstract perspective on reality that helps you navigate reality. And the question then should be, do these abstractions really do that? Ayn Rand called concepts, they're tools. They're tools of thinking, they're tools of cognition. So she would often say, emotions are not tools of cognition. Well, what are tools? Well, your concepts and your ideas and your principles. But tools should be, they're helping you achieve something. And it's a tool in that sense. It should be, why do I need another tool? And someone has to convince you of whether you're building a house and you're trying to nail the beams, the 2x4s, and construct your subfloor, and you've got a hammer, and someone says, well, why don't you use this nail gun? It should be like, what do I need a nail gun for? And then if they can convince you, no, like this makes it a lot better than if all you have is a hammer. It's it's faster, it's more efficient, so you can do stuff that you couldn't do with just a hammer. Oh, okay, so then it has a value. And in that sense, all abstractions, including certainly the most abstract, you should be a little suspicious of them until they really prove their value. And so in part of thinking about the principles of objectivism, it's another perspective on thinking of if they're true. So do they help illuminate and understand the world such that you can navigate it better? And Ayn Rand's perspective on objectivism is, yeah, I mean, that's what the principles are for. They're to help you do that. And if they're not helping you, there's something really wrong, I think she thinks, about what a philosophy is doing. It's why she stresses in philosophy in philosophical detection, the companion to philosophy who needs it. A question in thinking about philosophical ideas should always be, what does it do to a life? What does it mean for a life? Beginning with your own. Does it help it in advancing, but in a broad sense, not does it help me make $5 extra tomorrow, but in a broad sense, does it push and advance my life? Does it push it forward or not? That should always be at the forefront. And in looking at philosophy, and objectivism, that's what we'll be looking at. The other two arguments, I think, are inherent to the nature of philosophy. And it's part of what I think, even in the description of them, Dr. Peikoff is indicating. There is an issue of getting the proper relationship between philosophy and self, or philosophy and your individuality. And there is a relationship between philosophy and the outer world, and that it puts me into conflict. I think both of these are real and they're inescapable in the end, particularly from objectivism's perspective. And this is also why I had you read Philosophy and Sense of Life. Part of Ayn Rand's perspective on philosophy is that it helps you establish your identity. But that also means to change it and to change aspects that you think are wrong. So in her, let me just read a little bit of what she writes. This is a deep perspective, but I think in the end, this is the right perspective to have on philosophy. By the time he reaches adolescence, a man's knowledge is sufficient to deal with broad fundamentals. This is the period when he becomes aware of the need to translate his incoherent, but notice that adjective, incoherent sense of life into conscious terms. This is the period when he gropes for such things as the meaning of life, for principles, ideals, values, and desperately for self-assertion. And since nothing is done in our anti-rational culture to assist a young mind in this crucial transition, and everything possible is done to hamper, cripple, stultify it, the result is the frantic, hysterical irrationality of most adolescents, particularly today. Theirs is the agony of the unborn, of minds going through a process of atrophy at the time set by nature for their growth. But, so she's making or stressing a point about today, that nothing is done to help a person in this transition. And in a more rational culture, things would be done. But it's still a difficult transition. And it's sorting out, in terms of conclusions and ideas and orientation towards life, that I've started to form. What is right? What is wrong about it? What should I keep? What should I discard? What should I try to strengthen? What should I try to eventually hope and work that it withers away? And she stresses that a sense of life is crucially connected to your identity and to your experience of yourself. And the perspective in objectivism is, it's a dual perspective, that you should take really seriously your own identity and your own conclusions, values, including when those conclusions are wrong and when those values are misvalues, and try to work and bring order, logic, rationality to this. And that you can experience that, and that you will experience that as that in some ways I'm fighting against what I am in order to get to what I want to be. That's a real phenomenon in life, particularly if you have a philosophical orientation towards life, I think. And so to learn to navigate that is not to say that it's not a real issue in life. And what objectivism does not say is, yeah, just take your individuality as it is, and everything revolves around that. That's not true. Nor does it say you have a set of principles, to hell with your individuality. This is what you're supposed to be doing, and we're all robots and we will all look alike. It doesn't say that either. It says you're trying to bring integration to these two things, and that integration is a complex integration. And that one can experience it as there's conflicts, I think is unavoidable, that one would experience certain conflict. It's certainly this was, I noticed a couple of people in their assignments said this, in a culture where you're raised at best in a semi-rational environment. You're going to be exposed and subjected to wrong ideas, wrong perspectives, wrong orientations that become a part of you. And philosophy is about learning to work yourself out of those things. And the same is true in a different kind of way, I think, when it's philosophy in relation to other people. So there's a way in which these two arguments of philosophy versus self and philosophy versus other people, what they're claiming is that ignorance is bliss. If I didn't know all these philosophical things, I wouldn't think that there's some things wrong about the way I think or what I believe or the way I function, and I wouldn't have to try to reorient and so on. If I didn't know these things, I wouldn't face this kind of conflict. So ignorance is bliss. And objectivism's perspective is, no, it's useful to know these things. There is a conflict sometimes, but you should try to work that conflict through. And it can be difficult, and you can't hold yourself to too high a standard in order to do that, but that this is part of what philosophy is for. And the same in conflict with other people, it's that, well, other people are going to disagree with my philosophy, and I'm going to have very different ideas, and we're going to often have very different perspectives on the same things in the world, different evaluations. We're going to think different things are true and different things are false. If I didn't know this stuff, I would just think of kind of what everybody else thinks. And so it's a kind of argument that ignorance is bliss. And objectivism perspective, I think, is, no, this knowledge is valuable to have, but it is true that it doesn't pit you in the sense that it's always a conflict. But the fact that you're going to disagree with people all the time about all kinds of things is true of having I think essentially, and this Dr. Peikoff says as well, leaving aside a few times in the history where philosophy is very widespread, this is true. It's not unique to objectivism. If you were, an example that I often give, if you came to think, look, slavery is an abomination and evil, and you're an abolitionist in the 19th century, you have a life where you're constantly in opposition to what the dominant kind of strand of thought is. And it's experienced as, like, I'm in conflict with people all the time. And that is an aspect of having a philosophy that is not widely embraced. And I think there's no getting around that again. So in that sense, those arguments are different than the argument that philosophy is useless. If philosophy is useless, there's no point in having it. But you can think it's useful and still think there's teeth to these other arguments, that they're real issues in life. And as I said, I think they're real issues, and they're a way in which they're inescapable issues. And you will experience these as an objectivist, for instance. And the issue then is how to think about these, not to dismiss the whole issue and argument as though it doesn't come up in life. Okay, let me put a few minutes on questions, and then I'll say in the last 5 minutes a couple things that just about the more administration of the course. But any follow up on that?
Yes, Onkar, I wanted to ask, in the Romantic Manifesto on page 22 in the Centennial edition, I think it's a middle paragraph, there's a part where it talks about love being an expression of philosophy and that human existence needs conscious power. Goes on to say basically an integration of a conscious philosophy with, I'm assuming, the unconscious sense of self, manner of love, becomes what she says is the greatest reward of man's life, which to me was definitely an answer to it not being useless if you're in that process of integrating your philosophy and becoming aware and applying that. And what I wanted to ask is that essentially the difference between what Ayn Rand looks at as love and romantic love?
I'm not sure I get what the this is. So but I'll say a word on the issue of love and why I think she's singling out it as romantic love in this context. Because I think it's this element of individuality that, and it's right, I think, what you brought up, that she thinks of philosophy as strengthening a sense of self, but that doesn't mean just accepting yourself as this is what I am and this is where I come from, everything's right about it. But it's formulating and developing a sense of self, of saying, this is how I face the world, these are the principles that I think are true, and they're embedded in my mind, in my soul, and in my life, in my daily actions. And that properly, that's what a philosophy does, and what objectivism is meant to do. And in that sense, it gives you a sense of self in that you can explicitly articulate, this is what I'm about, this is what I value in life, this is what I'm going after, this is why I regard my life as meaningful. And you can give expression to that. But it has to be embedded in the person. And I think you put it in terms of an unconscious, and the way she puts it is in terms of a subconscious. It's that your conscious mind and the values, ideas, and embedded in your mind that you're not always conscious of, though when she thinks of it as an integration or harmony, it's you can bring these up to consciousness and understand that these are the ideas and principles and values embedded in my soul and my functioning, and the habitual way that I face and deal with the world. The issue of romantic love is highly individual, as against friendship, as against these are the sports I like, or this is the kind of exercise that I like to do. The romantic love is tied uniquely to a person and your relationship to that person, your interaction with that person. And she thinks of it as properly a highly individual interaction, that romantic love really comes into existence as a cultural phenomenon with the Enlightenment, and then later into the 19th century and the century of Romanticism, which she thinks of as the glorification of the individual as an individual. And part of the way she puts it in philosophy, who needs it, irreplaceable, unique individual. And part of the way she thinks of what a sense of life is, it's part of what makes an individual the unique individual he is. And that's the tie to it, that it's involved in romantic love and the selection of a partner in romantic love. I think the reasons for that are complicated, because I think what a sense of life is complicated. I think one should read Philosophy and Sense of Life, and almost on every page there should be, what exactly is she talking about? What does she mean by an emotional generalization? Why does she think of this as both highly abstract and uniquely individual? Like, that seems a contradiction. If it's very abstract, then it applies to all kinds of things and it ranges over all kinds of things. How can it be very individual and yet very abstract? And I mean, there's things to say about that, but this is, again, in terms of reading and not taking things too easily and having, okay, yeah, this is what she's saying. Is this true or not? And what are my reasons for thinking that it's true? And when we get to aesthetics, and I mean, we're not going to talk very much about aesthetics, but a little bit as a branch of philosophy, we might talk about the issue of sense of life a little bit more. Well, let me then give a formal welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us again. So this is our second class, our second lecture class. You had some further discussion on Thursday. We're going to now, in some ways, it's a continuation of what we were talking about last time, but with a major new element introduced into the discussion. So I put it as the topic is philosophy and the erroneous method, or you could say methodology, of rationalism. So we're still talking about philosophy as a subject. Both, we'll talk a little bit about its content, but now more of a focus on methodology. Let me recap a little bit of what we talked about last time, and there's a couple of issues that I want to just make one or two extra comments on. Some came up in the assignments or in the discussions on Thursday, and I just want to add a word or two about them. So last time, in talking about philosophy, we talked about, I talked about both objectivism as a philosophy. In various ways, you can look at what the nature or the identity of objectivism is, that it's Ayn Rand's philosophy, that she viewed it as a philosophy for living on Earth. She viewed it as having essential principles or tenets that she would often summarize. One place was in one of the readings in Philosophical Detection. You can read a slightly different summary in Introducing Objectivism. So you can look at it as it's those key principles that are then defined and integrated into a whole system of philosophy. I talked about, if you take a wider historical perspective, you can think of it as addressing many of the themes of the Enlightenment, both on the side of what was good and valuable and true in the Enlightenment, and trying to give that further and more profound and true philosophical foundation, and also weeding out all kinds of errors, I think, that were made, and I think Ayn Rand thinks were made by the better thinkers of the Enlightenment. And the flip side of that is you can then view it as an answer to Kant and to Kant's attack on the Enlightenment philosophers. And that Ayn Rand did view objectivism in a secondary way as that, and that the widest perspective you can take on it is that it's a development, or a major development, from Aristotle's philosophy, or the Aristotelian tradition, or line of thought in philosophy. One issue that came up that I didn't talk about this, but I forget if this came up in the assignment. I think it came in one in the discussion, maybe Aaron in your discussion session, about objectivism as an open or closed philosophy. And those who, so this might not ring any bells, but I bet for some of you it does ring bells, because this was in the late 1990s, so just before the 2000s. There was a dispute within objectivism, and you can say more especially within ARI, about some of the intellectual figures there. And then there was a splinter organization that David Kelly founded, who was a speaker for ARI, speaker and writer for ARI, worked with ARI, started his own organization. And part of the characterization of it is something about, they view it, objectivism or something like that, as open, and ARI views it as closed. And that organization has gone through various names. It's the Atlas Society today, but this issue comes up, and new people checking out Ayn Rand, checking out objectivism, checking out the organizations that are interested or proclaim to be promoting objectivism, you often come across this. And I want to say a word about this because it pertains to the nature of philosophy, and I think how to think properly about what the subject is. Because I think the characterizations, and so will often be put now as ARI is closed, or it holds the line that objectivism is closed or something. And open, closed are metaphors. And I actually think that it's a package deal here. You need to distinguish elements and understand. So, and you can give different answers to these elements of what I think open and closed as metaphors, or trying to more, if we put it more literally, capture. And I put it this I'd make at least these three distinctions. If you ask, is objectivism open or closed? Part of what we talked about last time is that objectivism is Ayn Rand's philosophical theory or philosophical system. You could think of it as its integration of some philosophical theories, but it's a philosophical system. It's the name she gave to her philosophical system. And in that sense, it closes when she dies or retires and stops further delineating or defining the system. And I think that there's nothing special in regard to that than of thinking of other thinkers and other thinkers in other fields. So there's Darwin's theories in biology or evolutionary biology, and they're Darwin's theories, and they end when he stops writing and dies. Then those are his theories in biology, or Einstein's theories in physics. They're closed again when he dies or stops writing. And that's was the perspective that ARI adopted, and its perspective I certainly agree with. But if you ask, is philosophy open or closed? I think it's a different answer. Philosophy is open. So objectivism and philosophy, or objectivism and truths in philosophy, are not synonyms. So just as there's, I think, many truths in Aristotle's philosophy, but it doesn't mean that, well, no other truth in philosophy can be discovered. And I think Ayn Rand discovered further truths. It may well happen that 100 years from now, there's a thinker and you think that it's new major discoveries in philosophy, new philosophical principles that you then think are true. So there's no claim, and Ayn Rand never made a claim, Dr. Peikoff never made a claim, there's never been a claim around ARI that philosophy is closed. And if you really think of it as it's a branch of knowledge, it's a science, just like the other sciences, you can say Darwin's evolutionary theories, they're closed when he dies. Those are his theories. But the subject of evolutionary biology is not closed. And something that is similar is true of philosophy and of a particular theory in philosophy, which is what objectivism is. And a third thing that acts is, in effect, you have to distinguish that, and these are all being run together. And the idea of a package deal is you're running things together that differ either in their importance, in their truth status, in their value significance, and you're putting it all in a package so that you have to say the same thing about all of it. So it's either, do you advocate that it's open or closed? And you have to say, well, open or no closed. And part of the reason to distinguish the elements of the package is that you can say objectivism is closed and philosophy is open. And I think that's the right position. And the third axis then is in terms of thinking about organizations. And there's the kind of question, is ARI open or closed? And when these issues were really being debated, it was often put that ARI is interested only in preaching to the choir. So you only want to talk to people who already agree with you. And that was the sense in which it's a closed little environment. And to get into that environment, you have to sort of be a card-carrying objectivist. And that's the only person we will talk to. And if you ever step out of line or something like that, we don't want anything to do with you. And so the sense of you, are you open to newcomers, to people who disagree with you? Are you interested in having discussions, debates, and so on? And to that, on that axis as well, I would say ARI is open. And if you look at its history in the last 10, 15 years, certainly since I've been here, we've engaged with all kinds of organizations, all kinds of different intellectuals, both more on the public sphere. I mean, just think of recently people like Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson, the Weinstein brothers. So We've dealt with various organizations. On the more academic side, we've dealt both with, professors in philosophy and business schools, and on. You can literally fill pages and pages of a list of outside and non-objectivist organizations, and organizations that even, there's significant disagreement about various issues, including philosophical issues. But you can do that in a way that stays consistent to and upholds that objectivism is a closed system. It's not open to anyone rewriting it. It's what Ayn Rand originated and created in creating a philosophical system or a philosophical theory. So that's a further perspective, and since there is ongoing debate about this, it's a further of thinking about what objectivism is as a particular philosophical theory, and thinking about what philosophy is as a science, and trying to get more precise and literal what the metaphors of open and closed might be designating or capturing. Okay, so that's a little bit sort of a follow-up on some things we talked about last time. Then we talked a little bit more about what is an objectivist. I won't recap that. Then we turn more generally to this. So I talked a little bit about the nature of objectivism, and then more generally about the nature of philosophy. And that what philosophy is itself a philosophical question that different philosophers or philosophical systems have different perspectives or views on, or different answers to the question, what is philosophy? And that objectivism is in, I think of it at least as in the development, or it agrees with the essence of the discovery of philosophy in ancient Greece. And you can think of that as it's essentially Socrates, Plato, and probably Plato, I think, is getting it as a whole system of interconnected issues and questions. You can think of it as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle as the real founders of philosophy as a new discipline. And part of the emphasis there, if you have ever had the chance to read Plato or Aristotle, is both on the inescapability and importance of philosophy to life. And I think to life means both to daily life and to making big decisions in life. So it's throughout life. And that's the perspective, as we were talking about last time, that Ayn Rand really emphasizes. And it's a way of holding the point that she's making in the lead essay of Philosophy, Who Needs It? I talked a little bit about that lead essay as indicating some of the evidence that Ayn Rand thinks is supports the idea, or the idea is that philosophy is inescapable and important, but that other things, if you're asking if we were to ask her, if she were alive, what other evidence would you point to? I think there would be more, as I indicated last time. And it's, she doesn't say it exactly directly, but the start of philosophical detection is, my lecture at West Point was devoted to a brief presentation of an enormous subject, philosophy, who needs it? And just the emphasis I'm putting, enormous subject. When she uses adjectives like that, she means it. I think, particularly when you're talking about her writing is very deliberate and carefully chosen formulations. I think she thinks of it as an enormous subject. The Philosophy, Who Needs It, the lead essay, indicates some of the reasons for thinking of it as inescapable and important. The whole book is part of the evidence. Part of the reason the book was written, or this collection of essays was gathered together, because it's all part, there are various aspects on the ways in which philosophy is at work, even when it seems, or often when it seems that it isn't. And the essays, they're introduced fairly often in exactly this vein. So for instance, this is again from Philosophy Who Needs It, censorship local and express. These are the first two paragraphs. I've been saying, so quote, I have been saying for many years that statism is winning by default, by the intellectual default of capitalism's alleged defenders, that freedom and capitalism have never had a firm philosophical base, that today's conservatives share all the fundamental premises of today's liberals, and thus have paved and are still paving the road to statism. I've also said repeatedly that the battle for freedom is primarily philosophical and cannot be won by any lesser means, because philosophy rules human existence, including politics. But philosophy is a science that deals with the broadest abstractions, and therefore many people do not know how to observe its influence in practice or how to grasp the process by which it affects the conditions of their daily life. A recent event, however, offers a clear, striking illustration of that process. It shows philosophy's influence in action and reveals the essence, and in brackets, and the contradictions, of both the conservative and the liberal ideologies. This event is the decision of the Supreme Court in 5 recent, in quotes, obscenity cases, close quote. And then it's a lengthy discussion of those cases and drawing out the way in which philosophical premises are at work, and that it takes work to identify that they're really there, operative, shaping the arguments and the debates. And you can think of that as a broader perspective on philosophy. In the lead essay, Philosophy Who Needs It, it's in the life of an individual and in an individual's own mind, the way in which, even if he can't fully articulate it and isn't fully conscious of it, the way in which he thinks philosophical principles are shaping and integrating the way the person approaches life. So on a wider scale here in terms of an institution, and she talks a bit in the essay about thinking of the Supreme Court as an institution, the role that precedent plays in it. So it's a wider perspective on a similar kind of phenomenon, she thinks, of the way in which philosophical premises are embedded and operative, even if not easily noticed. And there's many things that she writes where that's the perspective. So you could put it that the perspective you get in objectivism, what objectivism is arguing, is that man is a philosophical being. Or at least you can say once you think of the individual in a civilized society, or the individual in civilization, is a philosophical being, and not that he should be, but that he is. And that, I mean, so we were talking a bit about that last time, but this is a deep perspective that I think pays a lot of thinking, or rethinking, or chewing, to use the metaphor from understanding objectivism, of what this principle is and what are the reasons and evidence for thinking that it's true. And we touched on some of that last time. And then we talked about arguments against philosophy, and that really the basic argument is that it's useless. And you need real positive and in the end, firsthand evidence for thinking, no, there is a value to it. So in the arguments against philosophy, the basic response is, well, why do I think philosophy is valuable? And I would put it, again, thinking of philosophical detection, where she's emphasizing that you should think of abstract ideas in connection with life, beginning with your own. The real response to those arguments, or to thinking about the issue that they're raising, because as I said, from the birth of philosophy, there was a perspective, yeah, but these questions, they might be interesting to aristocrats with a lot of time on their hands and so on, but why should anyone else? These are just idle speculation, and it's useless in that sense. The basic thing to think about is, how do I think, if at all, it helps me in life? Why am I interested in philosophy? Is it an aid, or is it not? Or is it more like it's a game, or it's a pastime, it's interesting mental gymnastics, but it's not, it's the perspective that Ayn Rand has on it, that it's both inescapable and immensely important. It's just not the right perspective. So the basic thing to think about is, how has it helped me? And then the sub-arguments that it pits you against your own individuality or yourself, or it pits you against other people, those really, I think you think about those issues only once you think it has some value. And then the question is, or do the negatives outweigh the positives?